The dust whipped across Main Street as the first notes of fiddle music poured from the Silverado Saloon. But Cordelia Chapman watched the festivities from the shadows, her plump fingers nervously smoothing the fabric of her newly sewn dress. It was 1876 in Downeyville, California, and the annual Founders' Day dance was the social event of the season one that Cordelia had attended for 3 consecutive years without a single dance partner. The mining town nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains had prospered since the gold rush days, though its population had stabilized to a mix of stubborn miners, merchants, and the families who'd put down roots in the shadow of the mountains. At 22, Cordelia was the daughter of the town's only baker, a position that had guaranteed her plenty of friendly conversations with townsfolk who frequented her father's shop, but had never translated to romantic interest from any of Downeyville's eligible bachelors. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door to the saloon, which had been transformed for the evening. Tables had been pushed to the edges, leaving a wide open space in the center where couples already swirled to the lively tune. Paper lanterns cast a warm glow over the scene, and Cordelia could smell the punch mixed with whiskey and the perfume of the ladies who'd prepared for weeks for this night. "Cordelia, you came." Martha Wilson, the milliner's wife, bustled over with a cup of punch. "I wasn't sure we'd see you this year. Not after last time." Cordelia accepted the punch with a forced smile. Last year's dance had ended with her sitting alone all night, then overhearing Jeremiah Potter tell his friends that dancing with the fat baker's daughter would be like waltzing with a flour sack. She'd cried all the way home. "I finished this dress just yesterday," Cordelia said, gesturing to the emerald green creation she'd labored over for months. The color complemented her auburn hair, which she'd arranged in careful curls. "Seemed ashamed to waste it." Martha nodded approvingly, though her eyes held pity. "Well, you look lovely, dear." Cordelia made her way to a bench along the wall where a few older women sat fanning themselves. From there, she could observe without being too conspicuous. The dance floor was alive with movement miners who'd scrubbed the dirt from under their fingernails, paired with shop girls and farmers' daughters, all laughing and turning to the music. Her eyes were drawn to an unfamiliar figure leaning against the bar. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and hair the color of wheat, he stood out among the other men. He wore a white shirt, cleaner than most, with a black vest and a string tie. His cowboy hat was pushed back slightly, revealing a strong jawline dusted with stubble. As if sensing her gaze, he turned, and Cordelia quickly looked away, her cheeks burning. When she dared to look again, he was speaking with Hank Doolittle, the saloon owner. They seemed to be in earnest conversation, with the stranger nodding occasionally. An hour passed, and Cordelia remained on her bench, watching as couples formed and reformed on the dance floor. She nursed her punch, declining a refill when Martha came around again. Her feet ached in her new shoes that remained unscuffed from dancing. The music changed to a waltz, and Cordelia's heart sank further. This was always the most painful part of the evening, when men would cross the room with purpose to claim the hands of the women they'd been eyeing all night. She watched as Lily Peterson, slender and blonde, was approached by 3 different suitors before selecting the banker's son. "Excuse me, madam." Cordelia looked up to find the stranger standing before her, hat in hand. Up close, she could see his eyes were the color of the river in summer, a clear greenish blue. "I'm Garrett James," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone with a slight southern drawl. "I just rode into town yesterday. I wonder if you might favor me with this dance." Cordelia stared at him, certain he was playing some cruel joke. She glanced around, half expecting to see a group of men snickering in the corner. I don't," She stammered. "I understand if you're promised to someone else for this dance," he said, a small smile playing at his lips. "But I'd be mighty disappointed." "No, I'm not promised to anyone," Cordelia said quickly, then blushed at her eagerness. "I mean, I'd be pleased to dance with you, Mr. James." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Cordelia placed her fingers in his. His palm was calloused but warm as he led her to the dance floor. She could feel eyes on them, curious, surprised, perhaps even judgmental, but Garrett seemed oblivious as he turned to face her. "I should warn you," Cordelia murmured as his hand settled at her waist, "I'm not very experienced at dancing." "That's all right," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I've got enough practice for both of us. Just follow my lead." And then they were moving. Cordelia concentrated on not stepping on his boots, counting the steps in her head. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Garrett guided her with confidence, his hand firm against the small of her back. Gradually, she relaxed into the rhythm, and when she dared to look up at his face, she found him watching her with an expression of genuine enjoyment. "You're doing just fine," he said. "Better than fine." The compliment warmed her from within. "Thank you for asking me to dance," she said. "Most men don't. Well, they don't notice me much." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or disbelief. "Their loss, I'd say." The waltz ended too soon, and Cordelia prepared to return to her bench, but Garrett maintained his hold on her hand. "The next one's a reel," he said, as the fiddle struck up a livelier tune. "Do you know it?" She nodded, though she'd only ever practiced the steps at home with her father or younger brother. "Then let's continue," Garrett said, and before she could protest, he was guiding her into position for the reel. This dance required more movement, more energy, and Cordelia felt her initial self-consciousness return. What if she looked ridiculous? What if her size made her clumsy? But Garrett's enthusiasm was infectious. He moved with the natural grace of a man comfortable in his skin, and he seemed determined to ensure she enjoyed herself. When it came time for him to spin her, Cordelia hesitated. "Trust me," he said quietly. And then he was turning her, faster than she would have dared on her own, her skirts billowing around her. To her own surprise, Cordelia laughed out loud, a bright, genuine sound that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her. It had been so long since she'd felt this light, this free. Garrett grinned in response, spinning her again and again until she was breathless and dizzy with joy. When the music finally stopped, she found herself clutching his arms for support, both of them laughing. "You've been holding out on these folks," he said, leaning down to speak near her ear. "You're a natural dancer, Miss Chapman." "Cordelia Chapman," she replied, still catching her breath. "And I assure you I've never danced like that before." "Well, Miss Chapman," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Would you honor me with one more before I get you some refreshment?" Cordelia nodded, unable to stop smiling. As they took their places for the next dance, she noticed Martha Wilson watching with an expression of delighted surprise. Other townspeople were noticing too the way Garrett James, this handsome newcomer, seemed utterly captivated by the baker's plump daughter. By the time they finally paused for punch, Cordelia's face was flushed with exertion and pleasure. They found a quiet corner, and Garrett brought them both cups of the sweet beverage. "So, Miss Chapman," he said, settling beside her, "what keeps you busy in Downeyville when you're not dancing men like me off their feet?" Cordelia laughed. "I help my father in his bakery. Chapman's Bread and Pastries on Pine Street." "Ah, I passed by there yesterday," Garrett nodded. "Smelled like heaven itself." "That would have been the cinnamon rolls." "Tuesday is Cinnamon Day," Cordelia said, pleased by his interest. "And you, Mr. James, what brings you to our little town?" "Garrett, please," he insisted. "I've been working cattle down near Sacramento, but the outfit sold up." Heard there might be work around these parts with some of the bigger spreads outside town. He took a sip of his punch. I'm handy with horses and don't mind hard work. Figure I'll find something. The Hudson Ranch might be hiring, Cordelia offered. Mr. Hudson mentioned needing help with his spring roundup when he came by for bread last week. Garrett's eyes brightened. That's mighty helpful information, Cordelia, if I may call you that. She nodded, secretly thrilled at the sound of her name on his lips. Tell me more about this bakery of yours, he said, leaning forward slightly. I've got a terrible weakness for good bread. As Cordelia described the daily rhythms of the bakery, the pre-dawn mixing of dough, the satisfying thump of kneading, the way the whole building filled with the aroma of baking bread, she found herself forgetting to be self-conscious. Garrett listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest, his eyes never straying to the prettier, slimmer girls who passed by. The evening continued, and though Garrett danced with a few other ladies' politeness seemed to demand it, he returned to Cordelia's side after each one. By the time the musicians played the final dance of the night, the gossips of Downeyville had plenty to discuss. Who was this cowboy who'd singled out Cordelia Chapman? Was it pity, a bet, or something else entirely? For Cordelia, those questions hovered at the edges of her mind but couldn't penetrate the glow of happiness she felt as Garrett's arms encircled her for the last waltz. I'll walk you home, he said when the music ended and people began gathering their things. Outside, the spring night was cool and clear, stars scattered like sugar across the dark sky. Garrett offered his arm and Cordelia took it, hyper-aware of the solid strength beneath the fabric of his shirt. I live above the bakery, she explained as they strolled down the quiet street. It's convenient for the early mornings. Makes sense, Garrett nodded. My ma always said bakers and farmers see more sunrises than anyone. Your mother was a wise woman. She was, he agreed, a note of sadness in his voice. Lost her 3 winters ago. Pa followed a year later. It's just me and my younger brother now, and he's back east getting educated. I'm sorry for your loss, Cordelia said softly. My mother passed when I was 14. It's just me, Pa, and my brother Thomas now. They walked in companionable silence for a moment, connected by the shared understanding of grief. Here we are, Cordelia said as they reached the bakery, a 2-story building with a large display window now dark for the night. Thank you for walking me home, Garrett, and for the dances. I had a wonderful evening. He smiled down at her, the moonlight silvering his features. The pleasure was mine, Cordelia, truly. He hesitated, then asked, would it be too forward of me to call on you tomorrow, perhaps after you're done with your day's work? Cordelia's heart leapt. I'd like that very much. Until tomorrow, then. He took her hand and with old-fashioned courtesy brushed his lips across her knuckles. Sweet dreams, Cordelia Chapman. She watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the night before letting herself into the bakery. Her father had already gone to bed, but had left a lamp burning low for her. Cordelia moved through the familiar space, her mind replaying every moment of the evening as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom. As she undressed, carefully hanging up the green dress, Cordelia caught sight of herself in the small mirror on her dresser. The same round face, the same ample figure that had always been there looked back at her. But somehow, tonight, she didn't see those things first. Instead, she noticed the sparkle in her hazel eyes, the becoming flush in her cheeks, the way her lips seemed ready to curve into a smile at any moment. For the first time in years, Cordelia didn't go to bed thinking about all the ways she wished she were different. Instead, she fell asleep remembering the feeling of spinning in Garrett James's arms, laughing out loud with pure, unrestrained joy. The next morning came early, as bakery mornings always did. Cordelia was at work by 4, helping her father mix the day's first batches of dough while her younger brother Thomas stoked the brick ovens to the proper temperature. "So," her father said casually as he measured flour, "Martha Wilson's already been by." Cordelia paused in her kneading. The bakery wasn't even open yet. Harold Chapman gave his daughter a knowing look. "She wasn't here for bread. She wanted me to know all about the handsome cowboy who danced with my Cordelia all night." He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Said he couldn't take his eyes off you." "Papa," Cordelia protested, but couldn't keep the pleased smile from her face. "It wasn't all night, just a few dances." "MMHMM," her father hummed skeptically. "And is he calling on you today, as Martha predicted?" Cordelia ducked her head, focusing intently on the dough beneath her hands. "He might be." Thomas, who at 17 had recently shot up in height and was still adjusting to his lanky frame, hooted with laughter. "Cordy's got a beau." "Hush, Thomas," their father admonished, though his eyes twinkled. "Your sister deserves every happiness." He turned to Cordelia. "This Garrett James, he's respectful, treats you properly." "Yes, Papa," Cordelia assured him. "He was a perfect gentleman. He's looking for work at one of the local ranches. He seems kind." She hesitated, then added softly, "and he made me laugh." Harold's expression softened. "Well then, I'll be interested to meet this cowboy." The morning passed in a flurry of activity. Tuesdays were always busy, with the cinnamon rolls drawing extra customers. Cordelia found herself watching the door each time the bell jangled, but Garrett didn't appear among the morning patrons. By early afternoon, she began to wonder if he'd changed his mind, if the light of day had made him reconsider his interest in the baker's plump daughter. At 3 o'clock, she was arranging the last of the day's bread on the cooling racks when the bell jangled again. She looked up to see Garrett ducking through the doorway, hat in hand. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His shirt was freshly pressed, his boots polished, and his hair neatly combed. "Afternoon, Miss Chapman," he said, his eyes crinkling with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not too late for one of those famous cinnamon rolls." "You're in luck, Mr. James," she replied, trying to calm her racing heart. "I saved one especially." It wasn't exactly a lie. She had set aside a roll, hoping he might appear. As she wrapped the pastry for him, Cordelia was acutely aware of her flour-dusted apron and the tendrils of hair that had escaped her practical bun. She must look a fright compared to how she'd appeared last night in her carefully sewn dress. If Garrett noticed, he gave no sign. Instead, he leaned slightly against the counter, watching her with apparent admiration. "Been a busy day." "Very. Tuesdays always are." "Then I hope you might consider taking a break," he said. "It's a fine afternoon for a walk by the river if you've got the time and inclination." Before Cordelia could answer, her father emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. His shrewd eyes took in Garrett's appearance from his hat to his boots before he extended his hand. "Harold Chapman," he said, "I understand you've made quite an impression on my daughter." Garrett shook his hand firmly. "Garrett James, sir. The impression was mutual, I assure you." Harold nodded slowly. "And what are your intentions regarding my Cordelia, Mr. James?" "Papa," Cordelia protested, mortified, but Garrett didn't seem flustered. "Right now, sir, my intention is to ask your daughter to accompany me on a walk to enjoy this fine spring day. Beyond that," he glanced at Cordelia with a smile that made her stomach flutter, "I hope to get to know her better if she's willing." Harold studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Cordelia, why don't you go wash up and change? Thomas and I can mind the shop for the rest of the day." Cordelia hesitated, looking between her father and Garrett. "Are you sure?" "Go on," her father urged. "Mr. James and I will have a little chat while we wait." 15 minutes later, Cordelia descended the stairs in a simple but becoming blue dress, her hair brushed and pinned more carefully. She found Garrett and her father engaged in what appeared to be a friendly conversation, with Thomas hovering nearby, clearly fascinated by the cowboy. "Ah, there she is," her father said, looking up. "Mr. James has been telling me about his plans to speak with Mr. Hudson about work tomorrow. And your father has been telling me I should try the sourdough," Garrett added with a grin. "Says it's your specialty." Cordelia blushed. "Papa exaggerates." "I doubt that," Garrett said, his eyes warm as they rested on her. "Shall we, Miss Chapman?" With her father's permission and a warning to be home before dark, Cordelia left the bakery on Garrett's arm. They strolled through town toward the river, attracting curious glances from townspeople along the way. Cordelia was accustomed to being relatively invisible in Downeyville. The attention made her uncomfortable. "Everyone's staring," she murmured as they passed the general store, where Mrs. Pettigrew abandoned all pretense of sweeping to openly watch them. "Let them," Garrett said easily. "I'm the envy of every man in town, walking out with the prettiest girl in Downeyville," Cordelia laughed. "Now you're the one exaggerating." Garrett stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "Cordelia, I may be many things, but I'm not a liar. When I pay a compliment, I mean it." She didn't know how to respond to the intensity in his gaze, so she simply nodded and they continued walking. The path along the Yuba River was one of Cordelia's favorite places in town. In the late afternoon sunlight, the water sparkled as it rushed over rocks and swirled in quiet pools. They found a spot where a fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking a wider part of the river. As they sat, Garrett unwrapped the cinnamon roll Cordelia had given him and broke it in half, offering a piece to her. "I couldn't," she demurred. "It's your treat." "Seems a shame for you not to taste your own creation," he said. "Besides, things always taste better when they're shared." She accepted the pastry, and they ate in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the play of light on water. "Tell me something, Cordelia," Garrett said finally. "When I asked you to dance last night, you seemed surprised." "More than surprised, you looked like you thought I might be playing some kind of trick on you." "Why is that?" Cordelia tensed, crumbling the remains of her pastry between nervous fingers. "I'm not. That is, I don't usually dance." She took a deep breath. "Men in Downeyville don't generally seek out my company that way." "Because of your size," Garrett said plainly, not a question. Cordelia's cheeks burned, but she nodded. "Yes." "Well, the men of Downeyville are fools," Garrett said, brushing a crumb from his vest. "Where I come from, a woman with some substance to her is considered a blessing. Means she's well-fed, healthy. Means she can work hard and bear children who'll survive." He glanced at her. "Not to mention, when a man holds a woman like you, he knows he's holding something real. Not just bones and air." Cordelia stared at him, speechless. No one had ever spoken of her body in positive terms before. Her father and brother loved her, of course, but they never discussed her appearance. And the whispers she'd overheard from others over the years had all been variations on a theme: too big, too round, too much. "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. Garrett shrugged. "You don't have to say anything. I'm just telling you how I see things." He tossed the last bit of his pastry to a hopeful squirrel. "Now, why don't you tell me more about yourself? What does Cordelia Chapman do when she's not baking the best cinnamon rolls west of the Mississippi?" Gradually, Cordelia relaxed as they talked. She told him about growing up in the bakery, about her love of reading and her secret passion for writing stories that she never showed anyone. He listened intently, asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested. In turn, Garrett shared stories of his life on various cattle ranches across the Western Territories. He'd been born in Georgia, but his family had moved west when he was just a boy. He'd grown up learning the cattle business from his father, and after his parents' deaths, had drifted from job to job, sending money when he could to help his brother's education. "Nathan's the smart one," Garrett explained. "He's at a college in Boston, studying to be an engineer. He'll make something of himself." "And you haven't?" Cordelia challenged gently. Garrett seemed surprised by the question. "I'm just a cowboy, Cordelia. I work hard, try to be honest, but I don't have ambitions beyond finding steady work and maybe, someday, a place of my own." "Those sound like worthy ambitions to me," she said. "Not everyone needs to build railroads or strike gold to make a good life." He studied her for a moment, then smiled. "You've got a way of putting things in perspective, don't you?" The sun was beginning to lower toward the western mountains when they finally stood to head back to town. As they walked, Garrett offered Cordelia his arm again, and she took it, feeling a growing ease in his company. "Will I see you tomorrow?" he asked as they approached the bakery. "I'd like that," Cordelia replied. "I'm usually free after 3 like today." "Then I'll be here at 3, Garrett promised, "after I speak with Mr. Hudson about work." He walked her to the bakery door, and there was a moment of awkward hesitation before he simply tipped his hat and bid her good night. Cordelia watched him go, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. Hope, yes, but also caution. It seemed too good to be true that a man like Garrett would be interested in her. And yet, the look in his eyes when he gazed at her seemed genuine. Inside, her father and Thomas were closing up shop. Both looked up expectantly when she entered. "Well," her father prompted. "Did you have a pleasant walk?" "Very pleasant," Cordelia confirmed, trying not to smile too broadly. "Garrett is. He's a good man, I think." Her father hummed non-committally, but the corners of his mouth twitched upward. "We'll see. A man's true character takes time to reveal itself." But over the following weeks, Garrett gave them little reason to doubt him. True to his word, he secured work at the Hudson Ranch, proving himself skilled with horses and cattle alike. 6 days a week, he labored from dawn until afternoon, then cleaned up and made his way to the bakery to see Cordelia. They established a routine. Most days, they would walk together along the river, through the town, or up into the hills that surrounded Downeyville. On Sundays, after church, Garrett would join the Chapman family for dinner, contributing game he had hunted or fish he had caught to the meal. April turned to May, and the hills around Downeyville exploded with wildflowers. On a particularly fine Sunday afternoon, Garrett suggested a picnic. Harold, seeing the weather and perhaps sensing the young couple's desire for some privacy, suggested that Cordelia pack enough food for the two of them to make a day of it. They rode out on horses borrowed from the Hudson Ranch, Cordelia somewhat nervously, as she had limited experience riding, but Garrett selected a gentle mare for her and stayed close by her side. They followed a trail that wound up into the foothills, eventually reaching a meadow dotted with blue lupines and golden California poppies. "It's beautiful," Cordelia breathed as Garrett helped her dismount, his strong hands at her waist. "Thought you might like it," he said, looking pleased. "Found it last week when I was helping move some cattle to the high pastures." They spread a blanket beneath an oak tree at the edge of the meadow and unpacked the food Cordelia had prepared: crusty bread, cheese, cold chicken, and apple tarts. As they ate, Garrett pointed out various birds and plants, sharing knowledge he'd accumulated in his years of outdoor work. After they'd eaten, Cordelia leaned back against the tree trunk, contentment washing over her. The past month had been like a dream. Garrett's consistent attention had not gone unnoticed in town, and while there were still whispers, The tone had changed. No longer was she an object of pity. Instead, she'd caught more than one young woman looking at her with something like envy. "Penny for your thoughts," Garrett said, stretching out beside her on the blanket. "I was just thinking how different everything feels now compared to the night of the dance," she admitted. "I was so certain I'd spend the evening watching everyone else enjoy themselves, just like always." "And instead you danced until your feet hurt," he teased. "They did hurt," she laughed. "But it was worth it." Garrett sat up, his expression growing more serious. "Can I ask you something, Cordelia?" "Of course." "That night, when I spun you and you laughed, it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. But it also made me sad because it seemed like you hadn't laughed like that in a long time." He reached out to take her hand. "Was I right?" Cordelia considered denying it, offering some light response that would steer them back to safer conversational waters. But the genuine concern in Garrett's eyes deserved honesty. "Yes," she said softly. "I think I'd forgotten how to laugh like that, to just enjoy the moment without worrying what people were thinking about me." Garrett's fingers tightened around hers. "The world can be cruel to those who don't fit its narrow ideas of what's right or proper or beautiful." His gaze dropped to their clasped hands. "I know something about that. Not the same as you, but my family was poor back in Georgia. Dirt poor. Kids at school used to call me Scarecrow because my clothes were so ragged, and I was skinny as a rail before I shot up and filled out." "I can't imagine anyone calling you Scarecrow now," Cordelia said, trying to picture a younger, thinner version of the solid man before her. He smiled slightly. "No, I suppose not. But I remember how it felt being judged for something I couldn't help, being laughed at." He looked up at her, his eyes intense. "That's why, when I saw you sitting there at the dance, watching everyone else with such longing in your eyes, I knew I had to ask you to dance." "Out of pity?" Cordelia asked, her voice catching. "No," Garrett said firmly. "Out of recognition. I saw something in you that called to something in me." He hesitated, then continued more softly. "And then when I held you when we danced, when you laughed, I knew I wanted to hear that sound again, to be the one who made you laugh like that." Cordelia's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it. "And now, after all these weeks of walks and talks and Sunday dinners, what do you want now, Garrett?" Instead of answering with words, Garrett leaned forward and gently pressed his lips to hers. It was Cordelia's first kiss, sweet and tentative, over almost as soon as it began, but it left her breathless. "I want to court you properly, Cordelia Chapman," Garrett said, his voice slightly husky. "With your father's permission and the whole town watching if they must. I want to see where this feeling between us leads." Joy bubbled up inside her, and Cordelia couldn't contain the wide smile that spread across her face. "I want that too." This time when he kissed her, there was nothing tentative about it. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer, and Cordelia found herself melting into his embrace, returning his kiss with a fervor that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Garrett rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I should take you home," he said, though he made no move to release her, "before I forget myself entirely." Reluctantly, Cordelia agreed. They packed up the remains of their picnic and mounted their horses for the ride back to town. But now there was a new awareness between them, a current of possibility that made even their silences meaningful. As spring gave way to summer, Cordelia and Garrett's courtship became the talk of Downeyville. Some speculated that the handsome cowboy must have ulterior motives, perhaps he was after the bakery, or thought the Chapman family had savings stashed away. But as weeks turned to months, even the most cynical townspeople had to admit that Garrett James seemed genuinely smitten with Cordelia Chapman. For Cordelia, it was a time of blossoming. Garrett's affection and admiration gave her a confidence she'd never possessed before. She began to hold her head higher when walking through town, to speak up more in conversations, to believe that perhaps she was worthy of love just as she was. Garrett, meanwhile, proved himself an excellent worker at the Hudson Ranch. By July, he had been promoted to assistant foreman, with a corresponding increase in wages. He began to speak more concretely about the future, about saving for a place of his own, about the kind of life he envisioned. One particularly hot evening in late July, they sat on the small porch behind the bakery, where it was cooler than inside. Harold and Thomas had already retired for the night, leaving them alone with the sound of crickets and the distant murmur of the river. "Hudson offered me a permanent position today," Garrett said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Year-round work, not just seasonal." "Garrett, that's wonderful," Cordelia exclaimed. "Will you take it?" He nodded slowly. "I think so. It's good work, fair pay. Hudson's a decent boss." He glanced at her. "It would mean staying in Downeyville." "Is that what you want?" she asked carefully. In all their conversations, Garrett had never quite committed to putting down roots in her hometown. "What I want," he said deliberately, "is to be where you are, Cordelia." Her breath caught. "And I want to be where you are." Garrett reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. Even in the dim light, Cordelia could see it was a ring, a simple silver band with a modest pearl set in the center. "It's not much," he said apologetically. "Not what you deserve. But it's all I could afford right now. Later, when I've saved more—" "It's perfect," Cordelia interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. "It's absolutely perfect." Garrett took her hand. "Cordelia Chapman, I love you. I love your kindness, your wisdom, your laugh. I love the way you know just what to say to put a person at ease. I love watching you work in the bakery, your hands so sure and capable. I love who I am when I'm with you." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," Cordelia whispered, joy spreading through her like sunlight. "Yes, Garrett, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then they were in each other's arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of all the tomorrows they would share. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Downeyville. Most offered genuine congratulations, though a few expressed surprise that such an attractive man would choose to marry the fat baker's daughter. But Cordelia found that such comments no longer had the power to wound her as they once had. She knew what Garrett saw in her, and increasingly she saw those qualities in herself as well. They set a date in October, when the aspens in the mountains would be turning gold and the bakery's busy summer season would be winding down. In the meantime, Garrett began building a small cabin on a piece of land that Mr. Hudson allowed him to purchase on favorable terms, 2 acres with a view of the mountains, just a 20-minute ride from town. Harold insisted on providing the young couple with furniture from his own modest savings, while Mrs. Hudson organized a quilting bee to ensure they would have proper bedding for the coming winter. Even Thomas contributed, spending his free time crafting a rocking chair for the porch of their new home. On a crisp October morning, with the mountains aflame with autumn colors, Cordelia Chapman became Cordelia James. The ceremony was held in Downeyville's small church, filled to capacity with townspeople and ranch hands alike. Cordelia wore a dress of deep ivory satin that she and Martha Wilson had spent weeks creating, a dress that celebrated rather than disguised her curves. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Cordelia caught sight of Garrett waiting for her at the altar, his face alight with love and pride. In that moment, she thought of how far they'd both come from that night at the Founder's Day dance. He, the lonely cowboy new to town. She, the girl who never expected to dance. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. He swept Cordelia into his arms and kissed her with such enthusiasm that the congregation erupted in cheers and laughter. The celebration afterward was held in the town square, with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by nearly every household in Downeyville. Harold had baked for 3 days straight to ensure an abundance of breads and pastries, while the Hudsons had provided a whole roast pig. When it came time for the dancing to begin, Garrett led Cordelia to the center of the square, just as he had that first night. As the fiddle struck up a waltz, he pulled her close and whispered, "Have I told you today how beautiful you are, Mrs. James?" "Only about a dozen times," she laughed. "But I don't mind hearing it again." They moved together with the easy grace of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. As they danced, Cordelia noticed something she hadn't expected. Other couples were watching them, trying to copy their steps, their fluid movements. "Look," she murmured to Garrett, "I think we've become the example, not the exception." He grinned and spun her suddenly, eliciting that full-bodied laugh he loved so well. "Let's give them something worth copying, then." And so they danced, twirling and laughing beneath an October sky turning to twilight, surrounded by the community that had witnessed their love story unfold. When other couples joined in, Garrett continued to hold Cordelia close, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making you laugh like that," he promised in a low voice meant only for her. "Every day, if I can manage it." "I'm going to hold you to that, Cowboy," she replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Later, as the stars appeared and lanterns were lit around the square, Garrett and Cordelia slipped away from the celebration. A wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers waited to take them to their new home, the cabin that Garrett had worked on every spare moment for months. Harold embraced his daughter tightly before helping her into the wagon. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered. "So very proud of the woman you've become." Tears pricked Cordelia's eyes as she hugged him back. "Thank you, Papa, for everything." With calls of good wishes and a few ribald jokes following them, Garrett and Cordelia drove away from town toward their new home. The night was clear and cool, the moon casting enough light to see the road. "Are you happy, Mrs. James?" Garrett asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. "And you?" "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "With exactly who I'm supposed to be with." When they reached the cabin, Garrett insisted on carrying Cordelia across the threshold. Inside, they found that friends had been busy during the celebration. A fire was burning in the small stone fireplace, casting a warm glow over the simple but comfortable furnishings. Fresh flowers stood in a vase on the table, and the bed was turned down invitingly. "Welcome home, Cordelia," Garrett said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Home," she repeated, leaning into his embrace. "Our home." That night, as they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Cordelia discovered new dimensions to the love and desire that had been growing between them for months. Garrett's hands and lips erased any lingering doubts she might have had about her body, replacing them with a deep appreciation for the way they fit together, the pleasure they could give and receive. Afterward, lying in his arms as the fire burned low, Cordelia thought about the strange and wonderful path that had led her to this moment. If Garrett hadn't asked her to dance that night, if he hadn't spun her until she laughed out loud, would they be here now? Or would she still be the baker's daughter, watching life from the sidelines, never quite believing she deserved to join in? "I can hear you thinking," Garrett murmured against her hair. "What's on your mind?" "I was just remembering the night we met," she said. How different everything might have been if you hadn't asked me to dance. He tightened his arms around her. I like to think we would have found each other anyway. Some things are just meant to be. Cordelia smiled in the darkness. I like that thought. Besides, he added with a trace of mischief in his voice, I couldn't have resisted you forever. If it hadn't been the dance, I would have had to come up with some excuse to visit the bakery every day until you noticed me. Me notice you, she laughed. I think every unmarried woman in Downeyville noticed you the moment you rode into town. But I only had eyes for one, he said, suddenly serious again. From that first moment, Cordelia, only you. As winter settled over the mountains, Cordelia and Garrett established the rhythms of their new life together. Each morning, he would rise before dawn to ride to the Hudson Ranch, while she would often accompany him as far as town to help her father in the bakery. In the evenings, they would reunite at their cabin, sharing the events of their day over simple but satisfying meals. On Sundays, they would invite Harold and Thomas for dinner, or sometimes journey into town to join them at the bakery apartment. Occasionally, the Hudsons would include them in gatherings at the main ranch house, where Garrett's position continued to rise as he demonstrated his skill and dedication. Christmas that year was especially meaningful, their first as a married couple. They decorated their small cabin with pine boughs and berries, and exchanged modest but thoughtful gifts. Garrett presented Cordelia with a journal bound in soft leather, knowing her secret love of writing. She gave him a new hat to replace the worn one he'd refused to part with, along with a special piece of news. I've been feeling different lately, she told him as they sat before the fire after Christmas dinner, and I missed my monthly time. Mrs. Hudson confirmed what I suspected. She took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby, Garrett, in early summer. The look of wonder and joy that transformed his face was something Cordelia knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Garrett slid to his knees before her chair, wrapping his arms around her middle and pressing his cheek against where their child grew. A baby, he whispered. Our baby. Are you happy? She asked, running her fingers through his hair. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Cordelia, you've already given me more happiness than I ever thought I'd know. This, his voice broke slightly, this is more than I dared to dream. The months that followed were busy ones. As Cordelia's body changed to accommodate their growing child, Garrett became even more protective and attentive. He insisted on riding with her to town each morning and coming to escort her home in the evenings, unwilling to let her make the journey alone as her pregnancy advanced. Harold was equally solicitous, reducing Cordelia's duties at the bakery and insisting she rest frequently. Between her father and her husband, Cordelia sometimes felt she couldn't take a step without someone hovering nearby. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, she protested one evening as Garrett insisted on carrying a basket that weighed practically nothing. Humor me, he replied with that smile she couldn't resist. It's my first time at this. By May, Cordelia's movements had slowed considerably. Her once ample figure now supported a prominent belly that made bending or reaching difficult. She reluctantly agreed to stop working at the bakery until after the baby's birth, focusing instead on preparing their home for the new arrival, Mrs. Hudson, who had raised 5 children of her own, became a regular visitor, bringing advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and her own special tonic that she swore would make the birth easier. Cordelia accepted it all gratefully, especially the older woman's reassurances when her own anxieties about childbirth surfaced. You've got good, strong hips, my dear, Mrs. Hudson said matter-of-factly during one such conversation. And you're healthy as a horse. You'll do just fine. On a warm June evening, as Garrett was building a cradle for the baby, Cordelia felt the first pains. She waited until she was certain before interrupting him. "Garrett," she said calmly, "I think you should go fetch Mrs. Hudson now." He looked up sharply, instantly alert. "The baby." Cordelia nodded, one hand resting on her belly. "It's time." What followed were 18 hours of the hardest work Cordelia had ever done. Garrett was banished to the porch for most of it, where he wore a path in the boards with his pacing. Thomas was dispatched to bring Harold from town, and the two men joined Garrett in his vigil, occasionally attempting conversation but mostly sitting in tense silence, wincing at each cry from inside. Finally, as the sun was rising on a new day, a different cry was heard, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Inside the cabin, Cordelia collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but triumphant as Mrs. Hudson placed a squirming, red-faced infant on her chest. "You have a son, my dear," the older woman announced. "A fine, strong boy." Tears streamed down Cordelia's face as she cradled her son, marveling at his tiny, perfect features. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you, Mrs." Hudson bustled about, cleaning up and preparing for the men to enter. When everything was in order, she opened the door and beckoned to Garrett. "Come meet your son, Mr. James." Garrett approached the bed almost reverently, his eyes wide with wonder as he took in the sight of his wife and child. Cordelia held out the bundled infant, and with trembling hands, Garrett accepted his son. "He's so small," he marveled, carefully cradling the baby's head, "but perfect, absolutely perfect." He looked at Cordelia, his eyes shining with tears and fierce pride. "You did it. You amazing, incredible woman. You did it." "We did it," she corrected softly. "He's part of both of us." Harold and Thomas were allowed in briefly to meet the newest member of the family before Mrs. Hudson shooed them all out, insisting that Cordelia needed rest. Later, when they were alone again with their son sleeping peacefully in his new cradle, Garrett sat on the edge of the bed and took Cordelia's hand. "Have you thought about what we should name him?" he asked. Cordelia nodded. "I was thinking we might call him William, after your father." "William Harold James." Garrett's face softened with emotion. "I'd like that very much." He squeezed her hand. "And I'd like to add something else, if you agree. Michael, after your mother, Mary." "William Harold Michael James." Cordelia tested the name. "It's quite a mouthful for such a little person." "He'll grow into it," Garrett said confidently. "And in the meantime we can call him Will." "Will," Cordelia repeated, glancing at the cradle. "Yes, I think that suits him." Parenthood brought new challenges and deeper joys to their marriage. Will was a generally good-natured baby, but like all infants, he had his difficult moments. Nights of interrupted sleep tested their patience, but also created a deeper bond as they worked together to care for their son. Garrett proved to be a devoted father, never hesitating to change a diaper or walk with a fussy baby so Cordelia could rest. His large, work-roughened hands were surprisingly gentle as he bathed his son or rocked him to sleep. By Will's first birthday, Cordelia was expecting again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with frequent bouts of sickness that lasted well beyond the early months. Garrett worried constantly, taking on more duties at home despite his increasing responsibilities at the ranch. In February of 1879, their daughter Eliza Mary James arrived during a snowstorm that had isolated their cabin for 3 days. With the roads impassable, Garrett had no choice but to assist with the birth himself, following the instructions Cordelia remembered from Mrs. Hudson. "I've never been so terrified in my life," he admitted afterward as they gazed at their newborn daughter sleeping beside her exhausted mother. "When I think of what could have happened." "But it didn't," Cordelia reminded him, squeezing his hand weakly. We did it together. When the storm finally cleared and Dr. Peterson was able to make it out to check on them, he pronounced both mother and baby in remarkably good health, given the circumstances. "You might have missed your calling, James," he told Garrett. "Not many men could have kept their heads so well." Garrett shook his head firmly. "Once was enough, thank you. I'll stick to cattle." As their family grew, so did their prosperity. By 1880, Garrett had been promoted to foreman of the Hudson Ranch, and they were able to add 2 rooms to their cabin to accommodate their expanding family. Harold Chapman began to speak of eventually passing the bakery to Cordelia and Garrett, as Thomas had shown more interest in pursuing education than in baking. In the spring of 1881, nearly 5 years after that first dance, Garrett and Cordelia attended the Founders' Day celebration with their children. Will, now almost 4, was a sturdy boy with his father's wheat-colored hair and his mother's hazel eyes. Eliza, at 2, was a more delicate child with auburn curls and a determined spirit. As the music started and couples began to form, Garrett handed the children over to Harold's care and turned to his wife. "Mrs. James," he said with an exaggerated bow, "may I have this dance?" Cordelia laughed that same full-bodied laugh that had captured his heart years before. "You may indeed, Mr. James." They moved onto the dance floor, finding the rhythm together as they had so many times before. Cordelia was still a plump woman, 2 children and her natural build ensured that, but she carried herself with a confidence that drew admiring glances. Her green dress, sewn for the occasion, complemented her figure rather than trying to disguise it. Garrett held her close as they danced, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do you remember that first night?" he asked. "How nervous you looked when I asked you to dance." "I remember thinking you must be playing some cruel joke," she admitted, "or that you'd lost a bet." His expression grew serious. "It was the best decision I ever made, asking you to dance. Everything good in my life came from that moment." "Everything good in mine, too," she said softly. As the music changed to a livelier tune, Garrett grinned mischievously. "What do you say we show these youngsters how it's done?" And then, just as he had on that fateful night, he spun her faster and with more flourish than the dance strictly required. Cordelia threw back her head and laughed out loud, the joyful sound rising above the music and drawing smiles from those around them. From his place at the edge of the dance floor, Harold Chapman watched his daughter and son-in-law, his grandchildren clinging to his hands. Will tugged impatiently at his grandfather's arm. "Grandpa, why is Mama laughing like that?" Harold smiled down at the boy. "Because she's happy, son." "Because your pa knows exactly how to make her happy." Across the room, oblivious to the attention they were attracting, Garrett and Cordelia continued to dance, their movements a testament to the love story that had begun 5 years before, when a cowboy took the hand of a girl no one else would dance with and spun her until she laughed. As the years passed, the James family continued to thrive in Downieville. In 1883, they welcomed another son, Benjamin Thomas James, completing their family. By then, Garrett had saved enough to purchase an additional 10 acres adjoining their property, where he began raising a small herd of cattle of his own, supplementing his income from the Hudson Ranch. When Harold Chapman decided to retire in 1885, he officially turned the bakery over to Cordelia and Garrett. They hired a young woman to help with the daily operations, which allowed Cordelia to divide her time between the bakery and their growing homestead. The arrangement proved successful, with Chapman's, they kept the name in honor of Harold, continuing to be the heart of Downieville's community. As their children grew, Cordelia and Garrett made sure they understood the value of hard work, kindness, and integrity. Will showed an early aptitude for working with animals, following his father on his rounds at the Hudson Ranch from the time he could sit a horse. Eliza, much to everyone's surprise, developed a passion for mathematics, keeping the bakery's books from the age of 12 with greater precision than her mother ever had. Young Ben seemed destined to be a baker, showing the same intuitive feel for dough that had made his grandfather successful. Through it all, Garrett and Cordelia's love for each other only deepened. The passion of their early days matured into something more enduring, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and an abiding affection that was evident to anyone who spent time in their company. They had their disagreements, of course. Garrett's occasional impulsiveness sometimes clashed with Cordelia's more cautious nature. But they had learned early in their marriage the art of compromise, of listening to each other's concerns, of finding solutions that honored both their perspectives. One constant throughout their years together was the way Garrett could always make Cordelia laugh. Whether it was with an exaggerated story about the day's events, a playful dance around their kitchen, or a private joke shared in a moment of quiet, he never lost his ability to bring that full, joyous sound from her, the laugh that had first captured his heart. In 1891, 15 years after their first dance, Downieville celebrated its 40th anniversary with a grand festival that lasted 3 days. As respected business owners and longtime residents, Garrett and Cordelia were asked to help organize the event. The highlight was a dance held in the town square, much like the one where they had first met, but on a larger scale. Lanterns strung between buildings cast a golden glow over the festivities, and musicians from as far away as Sacramento provided the music. Garrett, now 41 but still handsome with only a touch of gray at his temples, stood with Cordelia at the edge of the dance floor, watching their children. Will, nearly 14, was awkwardly attempting to dance with the blacksmith's daughter. Eliza, 12 and already showing signs of becoming a beauty, was teaching a complicated clapping game to a group of younger children. Ben, at 8, was racing around with a pack of boys his age, occasionally stopping to stuff sweets into his pockets. "They're growing up so fast," Cordelia sighed, leaning against her husband's solid frame. "Too fast," Garrett agreed, his arm around her waist. "Seems like just yesterday Will was learning to walk and now he's trying to court Sally Thompson." "He gets that from his father," Cordelia teased. "That James charm." "Let's hope he got more than just my charm," Garrett replied, like some sense to go with it. As the band struck up a familiar waltz, Garrett turned to his wife with a smile that still made her heart skip. "Mrs. James, would you do me the honor?" "Always," she replied, placing her hand in his. They moved onto the dance floor with the easy grace of a couple who had danced together for years. Other dancers made space for them, many smiling at the sight of Garrett and Cordelia James, whose love story had become something of a Downieville legend. "You ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Cordelia asked as they circled the floor. "If you hadn't come to Downieville?" "If you hadn't asked me to dance that night," Garrett considered the question. "I think about how empty my life would have been," he said finally. "Without you, without the children, without everything we've built together." He pulled her a little closer. "I thank God every day that I had the sense to see what a treasure you are, Cordelia James. Even now," she asked with a small smile. "When I'm no longer the young woman you married, especially now," he said firmly. "You're more beautiful to me today than you were then, because now I know the full measure of your heart, your strength, your wisdom." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Besides, you still laugh at my jokes, which proves you're either deeply in love with me or have terrible taste in humor." "Perhaps both," she suggested, and they both chuckled. As the waltz ended and the band prepared for the next number, Garrett caught the eye of the lead musician and nodded slightly. The fiddler grinned in return and struck up a lively reel, the very same tune that had been playing on the night Garrett had first spun Cordelia, until she laughed out loud. Recognizing it immediately, Cordelia's eyes widened. "Garrett James, did you arrange this?" "Might have mentioned it to Jim earlier," he admitted with a wink. "It's our anniversary after all, of sorts." And then, just as he had 15 years before, Garrett took his wife's hand and spun her once, twice, 3 times until she was breathless and laughing, that same full-bodied, joyous sound that had first captured his heart. From the edge of the dance floor, their children watched with varying reactions, while slightly embarrassed by his parents' display. Eliza enchanted, and Ben simply confused about why everyone was smiling at his mother and father. Harold Chapman, now in his 70s but still spry, leaned down to explain to his youngest grandson. "Your ma and pa are remembering when they first fell in love," he said. "When your pa made your ma laugh like that for the very first time." Ben considered this. "They still love each other a lot, don't they, Grandpa?" "They surely do, son," Harold replied, his own eyes a bit misty as he watched his daughter and the man who had seen her true worth when no one else had. "And that's a rare and precious thing in this world." On the dance floor, Garrett pulled Cordelia close again as the music continued. "I love you, Cordelia James," he murmured, his voice meant only for her. "Every day more than the last." "And I love you," she replied, her eyes shining with happiness. "My cowboy who dared to dance with the baker's daughter." And as they continued to dance beneath the stars in the town where their story began, Cordelia reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from that first hesitant dance to the full and beautiful life they had created together. A journey that started because one man had seen beyond appearances to the woman beneath, had taken her hand when no one else would, and had spun her until she laughed out loud. In the years that followed, Garrett and Cordelia watched with pride as their children grew into adults, each finding their own path in life. Will eventually took over management of the Hudson Ranch when old Mr. Hudson retired, continuing the legacy of respect and hard work his father had established. Eliza's gift for numbers led her to become the town's first female bank clerk, later marrying a kind and scholarly man who taught at the newly established school. Ben, as predicted, found his calling in the bakery, adding his own innovations while respecting the traditions his grandfather had begun. Harold Chapman lived to see his great-grandchildren, passing peacefully in his sleep in 1898 at the age of 83. The entire town turned out for his funeral, a testament to the respect and affection he had earned over his decades in Downeyville. By the turn of the century, Garrett and Cordelia had scaled back their work somewhat, turning more responsibility over to Ben and his wife at the bakery, while Will managed most aspects of their small cattle operation. This gave them more time to enjoy their growing brood of grandchildren and to simply be together. In 1901, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a gathering that nearly rivaled their wedding for size and festivity. Friends and family from near and far came to honor the couple whose love story had become woven into the fabric of Downeyville's history. At the party, their oldest grandson, Harold, named for his great-grandfather, asked the question many had wondered but few had dared to ask directly. "Grandpa, why did you ask Grandma to dance that first time, when no one else would?" A hush fell over the gathering as all eyes turned to Garrett. Cordelia, sitting beside him with her hand in his, gave him a gentle squeeze. Garrett looked thoughtfully at his grandson, then at his wife of 25 years. "Because I saw something in your grandma that no one else seemed to notice," he said finally. I saw kindness in her eyes and a longing to belong. I saw someone who deserved to dance and laugh and be appreciated for who she was. He smiled at Cordelia, and I thought she was beautiful. But everyone says she was, the boy began, then stopped abruptly as his mother shot him a warning look. Everyone says she was what? Garrett prompted, his tone mild but his eyes challenging. Young Harold squirmed uncomfortably. Well, they say she was, bigger than the other ladies. She was, Garrett agreed easily, still is, and I thank God for it every day. He looked around at the gathered faces, his children, grandchildren, friends who had known them for decades. The world puts too much stock in what things look like on the outside, but the measure of a person isn't in how they appear, it's in who they are. In how they treat others, in what they contribute, in how much love they have to give. He turned back to his grandson. Your grandma has the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. She makes everyone around her feel valued and important. She works harder than most men I know. She raised 3 fine children, helps run 2 successful businesses, and still finds time to make sure everyone in Downeyville gets a special cake on their birthday. His voice softened. And she laughs at my terrible jokes, which is perhaps her most saintly quality. This last part brought chuckles from those who knew Garrett's penchant for corny humor. So you see, he concluded, asking your grandma to dance that night wasn't some great act of charity on my part. It was the smartest decision I ever made. I just happened to see what everyone else was too blind to notice. Cordelia, her eyes bright with unshed tears, leaned over to kiss her husband's cheek. You always did have exceptional vision, she murmured. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and sorrows. Eliza's husband passed away unexpectedly in 1905, leaving her with 3 young children to raise. She moved back to Downeyville, where her family surrounded her with support. Will's oldest son joined the army and was sent to France during the Great War, returning with both physical and emotional scars that took years to heal. Through it all, Garrett and Cordelia remained the steady center of their family's universe, their love for each other a constant in a changing world. Their home became the gathering place for Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and comfort in times of trouble. As they entered their 70s, they began to slow down physically, but their minds remained sharp and their affection for each other undimmed. They would still dance in their kitchen to no music but their own humming, Garrett still making Cordelia laugh with his exaggerated spins and dips. In the spring of 1926, as they approached their 50th wedding anniversary, Garrett's health began to fail. Years of hard physical work had taken their toll on his once strong body, and a winter illness had settled in his lungs, never quite clearing. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the home they had shared for so long, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink, Cordelia noticed Garrett studying her face with unusual intensity. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" she asked, reaching over to take his hand. "Just memorizing," he said simply, "making sure I remember every detail." Cordelia's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "You've had almost 50 years to memorize this old face. I doubt there's anything new to discover." "That's where you're wrong," he countered. "Every day I see something I hadn't noticed before. The way the light catches in your eyes. The small smile you get when you're thinking about something pleasant but don't want to say it out loud. The exact pattern of freckles across your nose." Cordelia blinked back tears. "Garrett James, are you trying to make me cry?" "Never," he said with a small smile. "Just making sure you know that I've been paying attention all these years." 3 weeks later, Garrett slipped away peacefully in his sleep, Cordelia's hand clasped in his. The funeral was attended by virtually everyone in Downeyville, and many from surrounding communities, a testament to the respect earned over a lifetime of integrity and kindness. In the days that followed, Cordelia was surrounded by her family 3 children, 11 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, all offering comfort and support. But in the quiet moments alone, she found herself speaking to Garrett as if he were still beside her, sharing the small details of her day, asking his advice on matters large and small. One evening about a month after his passing, she sat alone on their porch, watching the same mountains they had viewed together countless times. The air was sweet with the scent of spring flowers, and somewhere nearby a bird was singing its evening song. "I miss you, Cowboy," she said softly to the empty chair beside her. "I miss your laugh, your touch, your terrible jokes." She wiped away a tear. "But mostly, I miss dancing with you." A breeze stirred the wind chimes Garrett had made for her years ago, creating a gentle melody. And for just a moment, Cordelia could almost feel his hand in hers, could almost hear his voice promising to love her every day more than the last. She closed her eyes and smiled, remembering that first dance, that first spin, that first laugh. Remembering the look in his eyes when he saw not her size, not her plainness, but her. Remembering 50 years of love that had begun because a cowboy had taken her hand when no one else would, and had shown her that she was worthy of love just as she was. "Thank you for the dance, my love," she whispered to the evening air. "Thank you for everything." And somewhere, perhaps, Garrett James heard her and smiled, waiting patiently for the day when they would dance together again.